I am really honored to introduce Professor Trayvon Logan, who will be giving our keynote address this year. So Professor Logan is the Hazel Youngberg Distinguished Professor of Economics at Ohio State University. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and interestingly was just named the director of a new working group on race and stratification in the economy, which looks really, really exciting, and I think lends a forum for a really large body of interdisciplinary and important work that typically hasn't had that type of forum. So we're all looking forward to seeing the outputs of that effort. Prior to being at Ohio State, Professor Logan had appointments at Princeton University and the University of Michigan, where he was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Scholar in Health Policy Research. Professor Logan has written some of my favorite papers on many different topics. And the reason they're some of my favorite papers is because he combines economic history, economic demography, applied microeconomics, and just a really creative way of thinking about things that happen in the world that, like when I think about it, it's much more narrow, and he really broadens my mind. So he has had seminal studies on a number of topics, including the economics of sex work, the mortality consequences of distinctly Black names. I just saw a paper he posted on Twitter about the returns to having Black politicians using a very interesting instrumental variable strategy, as well as the evolution of segregation and upward mobility, among many other topics. I think he's also had some papers on sports too, which were kind of fun and interesting to read. So just a really incredible person and scholar, and we're so excited to have you, Professor Logan, and we look forward to your remarks today.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I hope that this talk will be generative today, and thank you for the invitation, the ability to speak. This is really the first time that I'll be able to share just a lot of the things I've been thinking about COVID-19 and having so many thoughts and then some great conversations that have taken me in new directions. And this talk today that I want to give will really center Black people and review sort of COVID-19, what we know right now from a few dimensions, and then really trying to bring all of that together and thinking about what it really tells us about American society. I think this pandemic reveals a lot of things about our past and hopefully directions that we can chart towards the future, and a really a broader perspective on what I think the pandemic is teaching us, specifically about racial inequality and Black racial inequality. I want to say that one of the things that has certainly impressed me in the time since this pandemic began here in this country is the pace at which we have moved as researchers to collect data and analyze data about COVID-19. And it's been an interesting experience to watch it as it has happened in real time. And this situation is in such flux that I'm not going to do a sort of traditional grand old person keynote about all the things I've been thinking about on this, but really to think about some reflections about what I see and what I've been seeing since March with respect to the virus and its racial dimension. So let's begin with where we are. So this comes from APM Research Labs, which I think is doing some of the best racial analysis of the pandemic. And so this takes us through the early part of November. And what we've seen is that Black Americans have the highest death rate from COVID-19. They were the first racial group to pass that critical 100 per 100,000 threshold. And they have been enjoined now by the indigenous people as the pandemic has entered what I call its sort of nth wave, because we're talking about second and third waves, but we really have not fully dealt with the first wave. It's just coming in these ripples that have now recently accelerated. And there's really interesting results in that there is some recent action to try to stem this acceleration, but it's been limited. We really didn't have a lockdown, despite what we might say in our politics. And so since we never really had a closing, to talk about reopening, I think, is a bit premature. But what we do see now is that these deaths are accelerating at a rapid pace. This is actually coming from May. And so before we think about the wave of the summer, it's important to understand that the pandemic had significant racial inequality. So the places where African Americans were outpacing their population proportion in terms of COVID-19 deaths was essentially most of the states where African Americans are located to any significant degree. And when we think about these states in the South not entering the red territory where they're sort of doubled in their share, we have to note that they are a much larger percent of the population in those states. So if you're thinking about Mississippi and Alabama, where African Americans are more than a quarter of the population, for them to be red states, they would have had to have been half of the deaths. So in all of these places, we see racial disproportionality at the very beginning of the pandemic, because this information comes from May. If we then track that over time, and this once again comes from APM, so that tells us the racial disproportionality as of May. And now we can just track it from June until today. We see this is more or less a game of some racial groups catching up to the Black death rate and accelerating, as we see the indigenous population has done since September. But we see that the Black death rate is really the one that's keeping the pace for everyone else. It's increasing this death rate by about 5 deaths every 2 weeks. Okay? That's the pace that we're on, 5 deaths every 2 weeks among African Americans in terms of their COVID-19 death rate. And so we do this age-adjusted mortality. Again, we see that the situation in the South and Midwest is worsening relative to the earlier epicenters of the disease, which would be New York and New Jersey. So it's important to note that this sort of spread is reaching more rural areas today. And this trend began in the summer with the surge in the South, and it is now intensifying and moving nationwide. This racial disproportionality is shocking. So where does that lead us, right? So we know that COVID-19 is racially disproportionate. Today, 1 in 875 Black Americans has died of coronavirus. And when I first started speaking about the death rates in August, it was 1 in 1,000. COVID-19 was then in August and remains today the 3rd leading cause of death for Black Americans in the year 2020. Heart disease and cancer will kill more Black Americans in a given year, once again from the CDC data. So for some additional context for this, think of the fact that this is an entirely new cause of death. Something that a year ago, in December of 2019, would not have appeared on any cause of death list. And it will now be the 3rd leading cause of death for Black people, and has been since the middle of the year. Now, we're going to close in on 50,000 Black deaths due to COVID this year. And to put this in some perspective, the 4th leading cause of death, which are respiratory illnesses, kill fewer than 15,000 Black Americans a year. So moving into this 3rd position is not just moving into the 3rd position by a little. There is a huge gap between the 3rd leading cause of death, COVID-19, and the 4th leading cause of death, more than 30,000 deaths, right, between them. So this is something that has come and has really taken hold and decimated the Black community in this country. I should certainly mention to an audience of demographers that the age-adjusted mortality is still showing this racial disproportionality. We know that the modal Black age, for example, is 27. I think the median white age is something like 44. So this age adjustment is important. And finally, the Census Bureau is reporting the CDC, is reporting now age-adjusted mortality from COVID-19. And we do see that it significantly impacts the mortality risk for Latinos with this age adjustment. But it does the same for Black Americans in terms of its racial disproportionality. So 3 times, essentially, the mortality risk for indigenous populations, Black people, and the Latinx community with respect to COVID-19, right? So this is something that, once again, is new. But I want to point attention to the unadjusted mortality risk, specifically for Black people, which is still twice the rate that it is for whites, right? So adjusted or unadjusted for population, this is a highly racially disproportionate pandemic that is, with incredible precision, targeting Black people in terms of its disproportionality in mortality. And this is shocking to me in many different ways. There are practical consequences of this. So one of the consequences should be that Black people are much more concerned about getting the coronavirus than other people. 65% are somewhat or very concerned about getting the virus. That makes a lot of sense to me when we think about how many Black people have the virus as a percent of the population. But more importantly, it also links to those who know someone who has been hospitalized. This is incredibly important. I know some people don't like opinion polls and they don't like the things that might come out of Pew, but this tells us, 71% of Black people know someone who has hospitalized or has died of the virus, right? And that's much higher than any other racial or ethnic group in the population. And so this gap in the social spread of the pandemic is actually shocking, right? And it's leading to these alternative realities of how people are experiencing the pandemic. And I really want to be clear about a fact of this pandemic is that it really only makes sense if you experience it. So despite the work, on the virus and the news coverage of it, the virus itself and the way that we have responded in terms of public health has taken away many of our social interactions. People who die of the virus or are hospitalized with the virus are largely excluded, right, from the population. You can't go and visit them. Many people who die of the coronavirus die alone. And so the virus removes people from your life in multiple ways, even upon death. It's a heavily hospitalized virus in terms of those who are symptomatic. And given the pandemic, we are missing rituals of grief and community when people do succumb to the coronavirus. That is particularly important for survivors. This is not something that we can take lightly from this pandemic, because it implies to me that the psychological toll of the virus is also disproportionate. This is not just the death dimension, but the people who are left behind and the ways in which our handling of the pandemic disturb these very normal processes of grief and passing and community, and also resiliency that may be harder to come by in this. I want to highlight some work that was featured at this conference that shows the COVID-19's impact on life expectancy in the United States, because I think that adds another perspective that we might want to use to think about it. This is in addition to some of the recent trends. Think about the work, say, of case in Deaton that has showed decreasing life expectancy in the last couple of years. But the concentration of COVID-19 in Black communities and the life expectancy decline is very large for Black people. And I want to put this in some historical perspective. So in 1900, the life expectancy gap between Blacks and whites was a decade. It was 10 years. And by about 2005, so it took a century, but by 2005, that gap had come down to 5 years. So In a little over a century, we had closed the life expectancy gap at birth from 10 years to 5 years. Okay? So keep that in mind as we think about how to frame this difference in life expectancy. So in figure 1 here of this paper, Black life expectancy without COVID-19, right, is lower than any other life expectancy at birth with COVID-19. So this shows the scope of this gap before the pandemic. But then when you add this in, you see that it's going to widen this gap because of the racial disproportionality of the pandemic. And it's going to erase a significant amount of the progress that we've made over the last century in closing the Black-white gap in life expectancy, particularly life expectancy at birth. We're going to lose around 15 years of mortality gains in terms of closing this gap with this pandemic. It's going to put us back to the level that existed in 2005. That itself was something that took over a century to achieve. And important to note that there had been some additional progress that had been made, a deep acceleration in the closing of this gap that has now been undone with this pandemic. So overall life expectancy in the US is going to decline by 1 year, and COVID-19 is going to reduce life expectancy at birth for Black Americans by more than 2 years. Okay? And erasing this gain, these mortality gains, particularly for the Black community, are very difficult to come by, and they take a very long time. And the coronavirus is going to completely unwind them. Okay? Disturbing. Some new work by COVID Black at Purdue shows another dimension that we haven't had a lot of discussion about yet, and this is preliminary, based on a sample of 500 Black COVID deaths. But it's showing a surprising gender dimension to the Black deaths in the coronavirus, and a heavy skew that the virus is taking, and the virus is taking on Black men in particular. I have not seen this borne out in other data, but I do think paying attention to the fact that there is this age disproportionality will be important. It will be important to layer on this another dimension that I'll talk about in a few moments, which may be related to this gender disproportionality, which is incarceration itself. So to review, Black people are getting hit especially hard from COVID in terms of the disease and death. But in this audience, that should not be particularly surprising. So we can turn to what I call externalities of the pandemic, which I think are particularly important, right? So as with the virus itself, the economic effects of the virus have been disproportionately felt by Black Americans. And this is in addition to Black Americans being in a weaker position than any other group before the pandemic began. So the way that this virus is working itself out in terms of those who are disproportionately dying of the disease is also now putting economic distress in that very same community. So let's talk about how not great the economy was for Black people before the coronavirus showed up. So the American Community Survey released their 10-year data yesterday, and this is what it shows about sort of median income growth for households in the United States. So between the 2005-2009 time period and the 2015-2019 time period, median household income increased by 2.3% overall, but only 1.9% for Black people. They were the lowest growing income, median income, household income growth for any group measured in the ACS, right? So whatever gains were coming out of the other side of the Great Recession were not evenly distributed or equitably distributed upon Black people. A salient example of how this has worked itself out disproportionately to Black people is going to be in employment. So this is coming from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, just thinking about this change in unemployment that has happened by race. And what we see is that every group experienced significant declines, and the impact of the initial declines was not racially distinct. The recovery, however, has had significant racial heterogeneity. Black recovery in terms of employment is slower than it is for any other racial group. So other groups that began and had a worse initial decline in employment have now quickly, by the middle of the summer, surpassed African Americans, and now Blacks have the lowest rate of recovery from any other group, given the employment effects of the pandemic. So Jabenga Ajalor has done some great work of breaking this down by race and gender. And what we see is that, once again, groups that had a spike in unemployment immediately when the pandemic first really struck us have recovered to a greater extent than African American women, who now have a higher unemployment rate as of the most recent job reports. Black men also outpace others and continue to have an unemployment rate that is above 10%. In fact, Blacks are the only racial or ethnic group to have unemployment as of the most recent jobs report above 10%. If we're thinking about its effects at the intensive margin of those who are entering the labor force, this is particularly important. Now, the employment population ratio had about a 2 percentage point gap before the pandemic, and that gap itself has nearly doubled. And what this is telling us is that departures from the labor force have accelerated for Black people, as they have also been slower to recover, right? So when we're looking at just the unemployment, it's actually obscuring what we would call true or alternative measures of unemployment that account for discouraged workers. 4 million people in this country have been out of work for more than 6 months, and that is considered to be long-term or nearly permanent unemployment. And it's important to understand the economic devastation in terms of how extensive it is. So Aaron Sojourner, who is an economist at the University of Minnesota, has been telling us that if every open position in the United States was filled by someone who is currently receiving unemployment benefits, there would still be 10 million unemployed people in the United States. The policy response to this pandemic has itself been uneven, and some of the, I think, most heinous policies have also been racially disproportionate. For example, earlier in the pandemic, sending meatpackers in to work in places that were disproportionately employing Black and Latinx individuals is also going to be important. If we think about what the pandemic does to people economically, it's really important to understand that even before the pandemic began, African American households faced significant economic distress. So it's shocking to see that in a typical month, nearly half of Black households have a problem paying their bills before the pandemic. And that increases a little bit when the pandemic actually arises. But this is actually, in lived experience, worse than it appears. So in the 2019 Survey of Consumer Finances, which comes out before this pandemic, only 40% of Blacks could get $3,000 from family or friends in case of an emergency, whereas 58% of Hispanics and 72% of whites could call on loved ones for some form of financial support. Every other racial group was above 50% in the fraction, the share of people who could call on a family member to help them with a $3,000 expense, except for Black people. And now we see disproportionately this economic catastrophe having an impact on that same population. If we're looking and seeing that nearly 50% of Black households have a somewhat or very difficult time paying their household expenditures, 25% of Black renters are behind in their rent payments. In September, more than 10% of Black homeowners are behind on their mortgage payments as of September, the highest rates being behind on their housing payments for any group. And this now has to be put into context with, say, the most recent household pulse survey evidence, which shows that a third of adults expect an income loss in the next 4 weeks. A third of adults have difficulty paying their usual household expenses, and a third of adults are actually in fear of eviction or foreclosure. In addition to that, we are now entering the stage where we have a legitimate and serious, and I believe accelerating crisis of food insecurity in this country. And the households with children are bearing the brunt of this. This is not a problem of food supply. This is a problem, though, of food distribution. We would have, and I think it's important to note that a pandemic could have disastrous effects on, say, supply chain issues. We have thankfully avoided that over the scope of the pandemic. But because of the economic collapse, we have an increasing number of households who have been food insecure. And Diane Whitmore-Shazenbach has done some excellent work with this, using census evidence and the pulse survey to talk about the racial disproportionality with food insecurity. We saw over the course of this summer a significant acceleration in the share of households with children who are food insecure. And Black households were topping out at nearly a third of Black households with children faced food insecurity. A quarter of Latinx households with children faced food insecurity. These numbers have recovered over the course, because most recent evidence shows that 23% of Black households with children have food insecurity issues. 19% of Latinx households with children have food insecurity issues as of this autumn. But that is still high above trend and has serious consequences on intergenerational transmission of capital, schooling, and other sorts of aspects of human well-being that this pandemic is now visiting on people who themselves may or may not ever contract coronavirus. It is also important to note, and this work comes from Javed Crooms of Howard University, that the assistance that does shows up slower for Black people. Okay? So Black people wait, on average, an additional week to receive unemployment benefits subsequent to their application. This is among a group who faces already extensive economic distress, difficulty meeting household expenses. And when support does show up, it is often going to be delayed significantly for this group. This has significant impact on stress, and I worry deeply about the non-COVID health of Black people in particular in light of the economic crisis. The impact of this type of stress on hypertension, on inflammation, on poor reported health, on psychological effects is important. We have not had, and I believe that we must have, a serious national discussion about a mental health policy in light of it. We cannot think that magically with the dissemination of a vaccine, we are going to turn the lights on and go back to normal. What this has done to people is not something that we can take lightly. In addition to this stress, remember that Blacks lack the wealth to weather the storm of a mild recession, let alone a pandemic economic freefall. This is so important because this trend also precedes the pandemic, right? So the pandemic's disparities by race are truly and honestly laced upon deeper levels of economic inequality by income and wealth. And what the pandemic has done is it's seeped into the racial inequality that is deeply rooted in the American economy. It is like pouring water on something that is marble, and it's going to find its way into all of the appropriate grooves as it makes its way through its path. And it's building a path of destruction that is predicated on this history of racial inequality. We have not had, for example, income convergence for Blacks and whites in the last 50 years. So we see that slower growth after the Great Recession on households that I was talking about earlier is mirrored in these mean and median, ability of these mean and median differences by race over time. We have not had significant convergence We also have a significant racial wealth gap. So Blacks do not have the ability to fall back on wealth to support themselves as they go through this pandemic. And how does this wealth sort of operate? I want to be very clear here on something that we don't talk about in light of this pandemic. In the third quarter of 2020, $100 billion was extracted from home equity in the United States. This is how households with wealth can weather this sort of economic catastrophe. The mortgage equity withdrawal is now 2% of disposable income in this country, and it was 0 at the beginning of this year. So those who have access to some form of wealth are able to use it and turn it into liquid assets to weather this sort of storm. Right? And this has dimensions because we think about wealth in terms of its inequality, the gross inequality of the top 1% or the top 10%. But it's important to understand that 25% of white households have a net worth of over $1 million, and only 4% of Black households do. So this is not just a story of inequality for the richest of the rich, but really about distinct distributions of wealth by race that allow some populations on average to be much better positioned than others. This work by Fenaba Adu at the University of Wisconsin shows this out and extends a trend that people who have analyzed racial inequality and wealth have known for some time. Wealth is intergenerational. So the people who can, for example, take mortgage equity out of their homes are people who've been able to purchase them. And so we see that this intergenerational effect is about transference and about who has wealth. What it allowed you to do with it is so important. And Black people, even with higher educational attainment and professional occupations, do not have that wealth. A Black person with a bachelor's degree has more than $20,000 less wealth than a white person who does not have a high school diploma. And so in the words of my friend Derek Hamilton, there really is, and nearly is, no Black middle class. These racial wealth gaps show up as people try to survive in the case of extensive job loss, permanent separation, and changes in the economy. But there's hope. Today, we have news that the vaccine has been approved, and the development of these vaccines with high levels of effectiveness offer a chance to put this pandemic behind us. But vaccines are only as effective as they are taken up. And Black Americans show much slower levels of potential vaccine take-up than other groups, although recent surveys have shown a rebounding of this. So we see that Blacks were maybe half as likely in May, it goes down to only a third in September, and it's rebounded up to 42% more recently. And so this rebound is still, though, less than 50%, and much less than for any other group in terms of who would take this vaccine. So when we talk about this lower rate of Blacks taking up the vaccine, we talk a lot about the Tuskegee experiment and medical mistrust that African Americans have. And so I want to spend a little bit of time and close by sort of unpacking Tuskegee, because to think about what this Tuskegee experiment does and why we go to it continuously as a way of thinking about racial disparities in medical mistrust requires us to then really confront some other aspects of American economic and social inequality. So the first place about unpacking something like Tuskegee is to put it in its place. And Tuskegee is in the Black Belt of the US South. Okay? So what is the first thing that we can talk about in Tuskegee? So for those who don't know, Tuskegee was a clinical experiment that existed from 1932 to 1972, operated by the federal government, the Public Health Service, to study the course of untreated syphilis in Black men. The study was deceptive in that the men believed that they were receiving a form of medical care. A treatment for syphilis was available and it was never used. And the decision to use Black men in the area and to not have them be treated for more than 40 years was justified by their contemporaneous lack of access to medical care. When this was discovered, this led to one of the studies you'll see in training about scientific misconduct to different standards for ethical treatment in medical research. Tuskegee is located in Macon County, Alabama, and it's a poor rural county in eastern Alabama. It has less than 25,000 residents. Today, over 80% of the county was Black in 2010. This is a classic Black belt county. It is also a place of intense economic distress. This is an area we refer to as the African American South, since these are counties with a disproportionately high Black population, and they have high rates of poverty. Even more recently, in thinking about the areas where hunger is an issue, Alabama has one of the worst hunger problems. This is a place that has been poor for some time and continues to be so. If we think about what has happened in these communities before the pandemic, these are places that are falling further behind the rest of the country economically. They have lost more businesses than any other rural community in the United States. They also have lower levels of school quality than other places, even in the state of Alabama. Okay? Lower levels of investment, tax base, and socioeconomic status. It also is a place that has other forms of health disparities. So relative to other counties in the state, health conditions here are particularly worse, okay, in terms of things that would be comorbid conditions. If we're looking at who is being impacted by the coronavirus in these places, these are African Americans. Okay? And this is also a place of low social mobility. So the Black belt in and of itself is basically a poverty trap. It is a place where people are poor and are highly likely to remain poor relative to any other place in the United States. If we're looking at the African American South, the likelihood of escaping poverty there, okay, is the lowest, once again, of all other rural communities. So if we're picking a part of the country that is economically distressed with low levels of investment in public goods, high rates of disease prevalence, this would be it. So the first thing to understand about Tuskegee is that it was something that picked out among the vulnerable itself. This isn't just a story of racial inequality. It is literally a story of exploiting a vulnerable population. And it's important to talk about this in another dimension, which is that the Black belt is also an incarceration belt. When we think about the life options of people in these areas, we have to understand that as of 2010, the Black incarceration rate was 1,800 per 100,000 Black population. These are places that have significant problems, also with access to medical care to this day. It's no coincidence that places in the Black belt have not expanded their Medicaid programs as of the ACA in terms of as of 2019. So it's important to understand the political economy of places like this, where African Americans are a sizable portion of the population, but for which they are not politically included in policy. Blacks wait longer in terms of time to vote. And work by Jacobo Williams shows that these counties have, on average, lower rates of voter participation as a function of the rate and number of lynchings that took place in them before the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Even today, the percentage of Black registered voters is negatively related to the number of Black lynchings and the lynching rate. And Macon County, Alabama, is one of these places that has historical lynchings. If we think about what's happening in terms of policy today, it is not as if African Americans have a lot of policy options when we have a political party that is captive to one voice and is offering, as of 2020, not a single policy platform. So the study of Tuskegee is that it's predicated on stereotypes of Black sexuality and the absence of medical care in the local community. It was also weaved in with economic, social, and political inequality that was a critical component. But it also depended upon the medical establishment, both Black and white. And there are studies today that link the discovery of the Tuskegee experiment to less healthcare seeking among Black men. But there's other work that actually finds limited knowledge of the facts of the experiment and no impact on participation in medical trials. So the precise role of Tuskegee in medical mistrust is unknown. Even without Tuskegee, however, there would be a variety of factors that would be related to medical mistrust, such as the function of the medical system, the continued bias in medical care, racist ideas about Black people, generalized racial treatment. These cannot be ignored. Are we conflating Tuskegee with the medical establishment? And are we particularly separating it from other events? So let's think about another vaccine, very famously and widely distributed, the polio vaccine. In Time magazine, hailing this as a major scientific achievement, which it certainly was. Okay? The polio vaccine was a success, distributed widely and outside of medical settings. You can't forget that it was distributed outside of schools, and its efficacy of 80 to 90%. It eliminated polio in the United States. Okay? And the number of cases of polio in the United States were also completely eliminated. It is a great medical achievement. What no one wants to talk about today, because we get so excited about vaccines, is an error early in the distribution and the manufacturing of the vaccine. Cutter Industries did not appropriately kill the polio virus in an early batch of production of the vaccine. And this is known to medical researchers as the Cutter incident. What happened with the Cutter incident is that 400,000 people were actually given the polio virus by way of this vaccine because it had not been appropriately immobilized with the formaldehyde. It led to 40,000 cases of polio, 200 people being paralyzed, and 10 dying. I don't think it is too far afield for Black people who have been particularly stigmatized by this presidential administration to wonder about the efficacy of something that is taking place under their watch. And we have to think about the competence of this administration to effectively create and disseminate a vaccine when they have shown very little regard for Black people and Black lives. So when we're thinking about the confidence that Black people have in the medical establishment, we have to remember that for many Black people, the medical establishment is also a function of the state. And to ask Black people to be particularly trustworthy towards the medical establishment, which is part of the state, is asking them to be cognitively dissonant. How can we trust a state that will not effectively or even appropriately prosecute violence against Black people and then expect that same state to offer you something that is going to be reparative or therapeutic? A state which literally has developed and exacted policies to incarcerate you and now wants to take care of you in terms of health, that puts you in communities and zones them, that exposes you to pathogens and disease, and now wants to offer you some form of assistance. All of these are stemming from central forces in the American society. How can we expect people to divorce themselves from them? And it's important to understand that the National Medical Association wanted the continuation of that Tuskegee experiment. It is not going to be enough to say that there are going to be some elites who are going to then take the vaccine and that's going to tell people something important about them. So how can a state that refuses to prosecute and root out its violent impulses against Black people now tell them to do something that they believe is in their best interest and expect for African Americans to believe that? It doesn't make a great deal of sense. The skepticism that people have about a vaccine is deeply related to the fact that Black people believe fundamentally that the entire response to this disease is a function of the fact that it has disproportionately affected Black communities. There's no way of getting around the commingling of the way that this virus is rooted in our own racialized inequality, and then expect now for us to be completely divorced of race as we work towards a solution.
So, Professor Logan, I want to say that I have been I'm listening to your talk, and I'm seeing how people are reacting to it on Twitter. People are texting me about it. So all of my different digital media are going off. I think it's really resonated with so many people, the way you synthesize that information. And on the medical side, we've been talking a lot about the vaccination and this idea of vaccine hesitancy. And so unpacking that to go beyond the medical system and kind of couching it in terms of the state was something that was very powerful for me personally.